Hi everyone, and welcome to the YouTube channel again. Justine from our sewing room, and today we're sewing up Pattern Emporium's brand new pattern, the Making Moves pants. These are a slight barrel shaped pant and they taper in at the ankles. They're not like your traditional barrel pants where they are very structured. These are just a very slight curve on that outer seam. The front seam sits forward a little bit to allow for that nice curve. Beautiful comfy pants on an elastic waist. You can use two types of elastic, so just have a look in the tutorial and make sure you cut the waistband using the elastic for the right size. You have a few different pocket options. Again, in the tutorial you'll see you've got the insert pockets, and the you've also got pockets that can sit on the rear, and you've got pockets down on the side of the pants, giving them a real cargo-y feel. So choose what type of pocket suits your style. Today I'm just going to make up the pants on the 40mm elastic around the waist. Now also it's important to do a fit test to check your length, because these pants, in the way that the shaping goes, you can't just cut them off at the hem and bring them up shorter. There are two adjustment lines on the pattern pieces, so you'll have a back piece, back outer piece and a front piece. So all pieces will need to be adjusted at those adjustment lines. So the adjustment lines for the length is at the bottom and at the top. So let's say for instance you do a test and you might cut the regular length and you think you want to do another maybe 1 or 2 centimeters shorter. Divide that measurement by 2 and take that off at each adjustment line. So for example, I've taken my pants up 2 centimeters, so I've taken off 1 centimeter at each adjustment line to allow for the pants to still keep that shaping. So make sure you read in the tutorial about adjusting for your length, and you won't know that length until you have made up a test pair. Also check your sizing. Remember to do your measurements. I always do a fresh set of measurements for every single pattern. These pants are based on your lower hip size. So once you've printed off your pattern, taped it all together and cut out the right size, it's time to think about fabric choices. So for my pair that I'm going to make up today, I'm using a beautiful lightweight linen. Linen's one of the recommended fabrics because it has structure and drape. It is also recommended that you can use a rayon, you can use a tencel, you can use a chambray. So any woven fabric that is light. You can use a very lightweight cotton sateen. The fabrics to avoid is anything bulky. You don't want to use a cotton, and you don't want to use a corduroy. You don't want to use anything thick and heavy, because there is gathering at the waist. Anything that's thick and bulky and heavy is not going to sit nice at the waist, and it's going to add a lot of extra fabric there as well. So just make sure you have a look at the fabric recommendations. Let's have a look at the pieces that we need to have cut out. You'll need a waistband. Now in the pattern this is cut on the fold, so you'll only have one piece for your waistband. I've actually got 2 because of the way I was cutting mine out, and I've allowed extra for the seam allowance to join that together. So you'll have your waistband. You'll then also have your front pieces. So these are cut as a mirror image. So you'll have a high rise or a mid rise. Now I'm doing the high rise for me. You'll have 2 front sections, cut mirror image. So those are my 2 front sections. You will then have 2 outer back sections. So the outer back sections will have that back crotch curve on them, and again you will cut them in mirror image as well. So by mirror image, that's just opposite of each other. So when you cut your pattern pieces out, if you cut them out with your fabric joined together, that will automatically create a mirror image. You then have your side back pieces. So these are the pieces with that nice barrel shaping, so you can see that on those legs. So you'll have a straight edge and a barrel edge. Now when you're cutting out your pieces, please pay attention to the notches. Make sure you do cut them in the leg pieces, and I'll show you why when we go to assemble them. So thread up your machines, grab your fabric, and let's start sewing. what we're going to do first is grab those two back pieces. So we've got the piece with the crotch curve, and then we've got the second piece, which is the piece with the barrel edging. So what I want you to do is lay them with facing the fabric facing the right side up. So what we're wanting to attach together is this long straight seam here, which is opposite to that curve, and then that straight seam of that barrel piece. So you can see that's the curved section there, and we want to attach these two straight seams. Now when you cut out the notches, you should have a notch at the top here. Let me just find my notches. You'll have a notch. Okay, so I've got one notch up in here, and then I've got one notch up in here. So the best way to start this is to flip this over. So I'm going to flip this piece over so I've got right sides together. So these are the top of my pants, and I've got right sides together. Now those two notches, we're going to start there. So where I had them, I'm going to just pop a clip in there. Now I'm also going to move along, and you will find a second notch further down the pant. So there should be double notches just a little bit further down. So they are here. So you've got your first notch there, and then you've got your second lot of notches here. So again, I'm just going to clip at those notches as well. And then what I'm going to do is clip right at the end of the pant. So clip at the end, and then clip at this end. And then what I'll go and do is pop pins in between those clips, so I'm joining those two pieces together. So let's go ahead and do that. So the reason that we start at the notches is because if you were to start at the top of your pant and just pin all the way down, you would find that it just doesn't sit together nice and evenly. So if you pin at the notches first, and then pin at the end, and then you can gently manipulate the fabric between those notches and that end, and it just sits all nicely together. So let's pin all that down, and then what we're going to do is we're going to attach those two pieces together using a 1 centimeter seam allowance and using a straight stitch on our sewing machine. And once we're finished doing that, we're then going to overlock that seam just to neaten the edges. If you don't have an overlocker, you can use a zigzag stitch on your sewing machine, but you will need to finish that seam edge just so that your woven fabric doesn't fray. So you can see now by me pinning that in the different sections, it's all just sitting nice and flat. I'm not having to stretch my fabric, and I'm just going to have this lovely seam that's going to sit there. So now that I've pinned all that, let's go ahead and sew down that whole seam using your 1 centimeter seam allowance. Okay, I'm now going to go down to my ironing board and just give that seam that we have just made a press. So what you want to do is press that seam towards the angle of the crotch. So you can see that this is the top of my pants, and I have that back crotch just going that direction there. So what I want to do is grab that seam that we've just sewn and make sure that it's facing towards that curved part of our pants. And then I'll press that, and then I'm going to just put a neat row of top stitching all the way along on the good side of the fabric. I'm going to use a blind hem foot, and I'll show you that once I've gone and pressed that seam. So if you've watched any of my previous YouTube tutorials, you will notice that we use the blind hem foot of our machine a lot to do nice, neat, straight stitching. So on your machine, this is the little foot that has, it has like a bit of metal on the bottom, which we use as a guideline on our seams. So just locate that on your machine and then insert that in to your machine. Now that little bit of the blind hem foot acts as a really nice guide along that seam edge that we've just sewn. So I'm just going to anchor that in with, so that edge there, if you can see, that bit there is right along the edge of that seam that we've just made now. Now I want to make sure that I've got enough room that it will give a nice, yep, so I am about 1.5 mil from that center that way. So just have a look what suits your machine, and then as we top stitch along that line, that blind hem foot is going to create a nice neat guide all the way along. So just continue that process until you reach the bottom of the pant leg. Now I'm not sure if you can see that clearly, given that I've used a thread to blend in with my fabric, but you can see there I've now got this nice row of top stitching on the right side of my fabric. So if you prefer just one row, you can leave it like that. Otherwise you can go ahead and do a second row of top stitching down there as well. Because mine's a linen, I'm just going to leave one row of stitching as my top stitching for that pant leg. Now what we need to do is just repeat the process on the second leg. So if you go ahead and join them together and repeat that process, then we'll come back to the next step. Now what I want to do is lay that back piece that we've just attached together with the right side facing up. So this is the top part of my pant, and you can see here that's that back crotch section. Now I've got that right side of my fabric facing up. Now I want to grab my front piece. Now I want to put that with the right side of my fabric facing down. Now how will I know which is the right front piece to use? You will make sure that this crotch section matches the crotch section of the back piece. So you can see there they're both facing the same way together when the right sides are together. So what I want to do is with that front section, I now want to attach that to that curved barrel leg side edge. So again, you'll find that there's a notch in the middle of that barrel, and you'll hopefully have cut a notch in the middle of your front leg. So starting with those notches, let's match them together and pop a pin in there. I then want to go down to the bottom of my pant and pop a pin in at the bottom. I'm then going to take that section between both of those pins and just run a pin every about an inch apart along that curved section, just making sure that both of my raw edges are matched together. So you want to probably go about an inch to an inch and a half distance between your pins or your clips. Now that I have pinned between that notch and the bottom of my pants, I now want to do the same thing from that notch to the top of my pants. And again, I'll pin them at the top first and then run my pins all the way down to meet that notch. Using it on a flat surface, because you just want to make sure when you're using a fabric like a linen or a rayon that you don't stretch the fabric while you are pinning this, because it will make your seams not sit nicely. So you want to make sure that if possible you are pinning this on a flat surface and not stretching your fabric out. Alright, now that I've popped all my pins in that whole side leg, so that's again that side edge of my pants. So I will have my pants with the two crotch sections facing each other, and I've got the right sides together and I've pinned along that whole outside edge where that nice curved barrel leg is. So what we want to do is sew that edge together using a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and then overlock to neaten, and then top stitch it again. This time we're going to press the seam towards the back of the pants. So like we did with this seam here where we pressed it towards the crotch section, we want to press this side seam towards the back of the pants and then top stitch there as well. So let's go ahead and sew all of those and finish all those steps. Now that I've sewn that together, I will have one piece that has got a back crotch section there and a front crotch section there. So that seam that we've just sewn, what you want to do is head down to your ironing board and press that seam facing towards that back section. So you'll know the back section because that's the one with the seam that we did earlier. So grab that and press your seam facing towards that back crotch section. Now that you've pressed your seam towards the back section, what you want to do is do another row of top stitching like we did previously. So you'll be top stitching on the actual back side piece. So this is my front piece here with the crotch seam. Moving along, here's my seam that I just did, and there's my back seam that we'd done earlier. So I want to actually top stitch on this piece here. So I'm going to run that top stitch along that seam down there on this piece, kind of the middle piece, I guess. So let's go and do that. So for our next step, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking this leg piece that we have already joined the middle back section, so it's still sitting open. What we want to do is we want to join this piece together at the inner leg, and we're going to do each leg separately. So what you need to do is grab your piece that's attached with that middle back seam, and I want you to just fold that with the right side of your fabric facing together. Then find where that crotch seam, the back and the front meet, and I want you to just pop a pin in that section there. So you'll have those two curves of your crotch section, the front and then the back, and I want you to just pop a pin in that crotch section there to anchor them together. Now just come along your pants until you locate that notch that you will have made in there. So it's about halfway down, so you'll have a notch on both pieces of the front leg and the back leg. So find that center notch and match them up together and pop another pin in that section as well. And then go all the way down to the bottom of your pants leg and match up that hemline and pop another pin in there. So in that inner seam leg, you'll have your 3 pins. You'll have one at the hem, one at that center notch, and then one at the crotch seam. What this will do is just creates a nice even seam along that inner leg. So now what you need to do is just continue pinning in each section. So just working evenly, don't stretch out the fabric, it will all fit together. You can do this on a flat surface if you find it easier, and just pop your pins in from that crotch down to meet where that first pin is. If you're finding you've got excess fabric in any one area, undo the pins and start from the other end. So by that I mean, if it's not fitting well together like that, start pinning from the notch up towards the crotch, or vice versa, until you get that nice even raw sides matching together. You shouldn't need to pull the fabric, it will just sit nicely together. Now we just do the same thing for that bottom section. Again, they should be matching up nicely together without any stretching of the fabric. And just pop your pins all the way along so you've got this really nicely evenly matched side inner leg seam. Now what we want to do is we want to take a 1 centimeter seam allowance as usual and just sew that on our sewing machine and then neaten that raw edge on our overlocker. Now if you have been top stitching as you've been going with these other seams, we don't need to top stitch this seam, so we're just simply attaching it together. Then we're going to go down to our ironing board and just iron that seam flat and repeat it for the other leg. So let's go ahead and do all of those steps and then I'll take you on to the next step. Okay, we now have our 2 leg pieces joined together at that inner leg seam. Now for our next step, we're going to take 1 leg piece and we're going to turn it the right side out. So we've got the right side of that fabric facing out. I've got my open crotch section there. So let's just pop that away and grab the other piece with the wrong side facing out. And again, we've got that inner crotch section like that. So now what I want you to do is I want you to take that piece that we turned with the right side facing out, pop your hand where that inner crotch seam meets. So that seam that we've just sewn, pop your hand there and hold that. With the other hand, grab the bottom of your pants leg and you're going to feed it inside the other piece. So again, put your other hand on that crotch seam that we just sewed so that you make sure that they're going in evenly. So where that front crotch meets that back crotch, you've got one hand and the wrong side facing out. Right side facing out, same position of my hand. Grab the bottom leg with that same hand and just push that inside of the other piece of the pant leg. Now what I like to do here so I can free up my hands is to just match those 2 crotch seams that we were holding, 1 in each hand. And I'm just going to pop a clip in there for now. I'll sort that seam out once I have my pants all nice and neat. So I'm just going to now continue pushing the rest of that pant leg all the way through. So I've now got the right side of one piece facing the right side of the other piece in that whole pant leg. Where I pinned that crotch seam matches. And now what I'm going to do is just match along that whole crotch seam. So you should have 2 front pieces of the crotch seam matching together and then your 2 back pieces of your crotch seam on the other side of that clip. So in effect you have now got your pants 1 leg inside of the other and you've got this open crotch seam that we're going to sew together now. So where we popped that clip in earlier, I'm just going to trim off those excess bits of cotton and I'm now going to pin that with my seams facing towards the back. And I always start at that crotch section so it's nice and that's my starting point. Again, I'm going to go round to that back section and I'm just going to place a pin at the top of that back section. Now we did have 2 notches on either side of the back piece, so again you can use them as a reference point and pop your pin in there as well. So I've now got 3 pins in that back section at that center crotch, at the top and where my double notches are. So I'm just going to continue pinning in between all of those pins. This creates a nice evenness when you're sewing that crotch seam. Pinning it in sections. So again, I'm just going to pin that in that curve up towards those notches. I'm then going to repeat that process for the front section. So again, I'm just going to, where I started in that center crotch, I'm just going to pop a pin at the top, joining my front section together up that way. I'm then going to start down at the bottom where that curve is. I find it sits a lot nicer to pin that curve in first. I'm just pinning about 1 inch away from each pin and I'm just going to continue that up towards the top. Making sure that that's sitting nice and flat. Right, now that I've pinned my crotch section, I'm going to head over to my sewing machine, and using a 1 centimeter seam allowance, I'm going to sew around that whole crotch seam in one complete seam. So let's go ahead and do that, and then we are going to finish that whole crotch seam with our overlocker. Now that we've finished sewing that crotch seam, we can turn our pants with the right sides facing out and go and iron that crotch seam down. Now what we're going to do is locate our waistband piece. Now I had 2 sections of my waistband, just the way I cut it out, if you remember. So I've just gone ahead and joined them at the with the 1 centimeter seam allowance and overlock to neaten. So if you did have 2 pieces as well, just join them together on only one edge now. Okay, so what you want to do is take your waistband, and the first thing we're going to be doing is heading down to our ironing board. I know I always talk about ironing. It is really important to press, especially with this step. It makes it a lot neater. So we're going to head down to our ironing board, and we're going to press our waistband, and we're going to fold it with these 2 short edges, and we're going to have the wrong side of the fabric together. So we're just going to fold along those 2 short edges with the wrong side of our fabric together, and you can just pop a clip in there, and then we're just going to continue folding that all the way along, and we're going to give that a nice press on our iron. I've now ironed my waistband. Now what we want to do is we want to take those 2 open raw edges. Now I actually prefer to overlock them or neaten the edges using what your preferred method is before I go ahead with this next step. So I'm just going to go over and overlock and neaten those 2 raw edges separately. Okay, so now that I have neatened those 2 raw edges, it's time to attach our waistband. So making sure that we don't create a twist in our waistband, I like to just lay it down on a flat surface, holding both of these raw edges together. So you just want to join them together like so, and just making sure that your waistband is not twisted as you're doing it. So you will unfold that, so you'll still see that crease there, and what we're going to be doing is attaching them on that open edge. Now here's a nice little trick that Pattern Emporium and Kate has taught me over the years, and it is a lovely way to finish your pants and insert the elastic. So I've now got 3 pins in my open section of my waistband. So I'm going to be sewing from that top, using a 1 centimeter seam allowance, I'm going to be sewing from that top raw edge right down past that line where we ironed it, and I'm going to stop about 1 centimeter down from that fold. So I'm just going to pop a pin in there so I know where to stop. So again, we'll start from that raw edge, so right past that crease line, and stop at that about 1 centimeter past that crease line, and back stitch there to secure. Then what I'm going to do, I'm going to pop another pin about 1 centimeter from that bottom raw edge. So you can see there, I've got a gap here. I'm then going to restart my sewing at this bottom pin, back stitch to secure, and then back stitch at the bottom raw edge there. So what I'm actually doing is I'm leaving a gap in my waistband. So I'm only going to sew down to here. I'm going to stop, cut my threads. I'm going to start back again here and stop and cut my threads. Okay, I'm just going to start. I'm still using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. I'm back stitching at the top. Just go a little bit faster. I'm now coming up to that crease, and then this is 1 centimeter past that crease. I'm just going to back stitch there and cut my threads. I'm going to remove that waistband from under the foot, and then I'm just going to put it back down again at that other pin, still keeping my 1 centimeter seam allowance. I'm now going to back stitch at that pin and just go to the edge and back stitch again. Okay, so now what we've created in that, what we just sewed up then, is we have an opening in our waistband to be able to thread our elastic through. So you will notice that there's a hole in there, and we're going to press those edges open, and then we will have an opening to thread our elastic through later. So that's what yours should look like as well. Okay, now what we're going to do is fold the waistband again with the wrong sides together. Keep that those edges open where we just sewed up and left that hole. So just make sure they're sitting open nice and flat when you create that fold again. So that fold should be there from when you ironed it before. Now what you're going to do is you're going to edge stitch that folded line. So this is really important because it will make the elastic and the waistband sit nicely when you're wearing it. We're only going to edge stitch about 1/8 of an inch in from that edge. So again, I like to use that blind hem foot that we talked about earlier, and I'm going to measure using my tape measure 1/8 of an inch. And pop a pin in there. So 1/8 of an inch is only just here. So it's a very narrow top stitch that we're doing. We're only going to be edge stitching along slightly in. So let's go on our sewing machine and do that as our next step. Okay, now what we want to do is we want to divide our waistband into quarters. So for me, I have the 2 seams because I joined mine together. But if you don't, so the way we will find our quarters is to find that center back seam. So that's our starting point. So just pop a pin into that seam. Now what you want to do is hold that seam like that until you get to the opposite end. So pop a pin in there. So you've got 2 reference points now, dividing your band in half. So one at that back seam and the other one at this edge. Now what we want to do is just match those 2 pins together, and then they will create our other quarter pieces. So just pop pins in where those edges sit. So now you should have 4 pins on your waistband. Now we're going to attach the waistband to our pants. Now I'm going to do mine just slightly differently because I have 2 seams in my waistband and I don't want one at the center front. So I'm going to have my 2 seams matching with the side edges of my pants. If you cut your waistband on the fold, what you want to do is the following. You want to locate that center back seam where we put the pin of our waistband with the hole. That hole we left deliberately early. I want that hole to be facing upwards so you can see it. Locate the center back seam of your pants, and I want you to match that seam in your waistband to that center back seam and pop a pin in there. You should see that hole sitting on the top as you're looking at that. Now I'm just going to do mine slightly different because I had joined my waistband together. So I'm attaching mine at a side seam, just because I don't want the join in the center front seam. So next thing, I want you to follow your waistband along and locate that next pin. Now that next pin will go to your side seam. So if you match that to your side seam and then anchor that down to the side seam. So you've now matched 1/4 of your pants together. Grab your waistband, locate that next pin and match that with the center front seam. and just pop a pin in there to match it. Moving along, find that third pin that you put in your waistband and match that to the next side seam of your pants. Lay that down and just anchor your waistband in. So you now should have your waistband anchored at 4 points of your pants. You should have your waistband anchored at the back center seam, at the front center seam, and at each side seam. They were the 4 reference points. So your waistband should be sitting nice and evenly on your pants. You shouldn't have to stretch it to fit, and it should be sitting nice and flat. Now what I'm going to do is between each quarter that I've pinned already, I'm just going to continue pinning, matching those 3 raw edges together. So let's go ahead and do that for each quarter of our pants. As I said, that waistband should sit nice and flat. You don't need to stretch that to fit. If your waistband's not sitting perfectly, a couple of things to look for. Make sure that you have matched that quarter to the side seam and not that back panel seam. So just make sure that you have found the correct seams to match it up to if it's not sitting flat. Otherwise, if it's not sitting flat, just check you cut the correct size for the waistband, and just continue pinning out all the way along in each section. I like to pin mine about 1.5 inches apart, so it's not too close for my pins, but it's also not too far apart that my fabric can slip. Okay, I've now pinned that all the way along. I'm now going to head over to my sewing machine, and I'm going to sew all the way around my whole waistband where I've pinned. And I'm going to use a 1 centimeter seam allowance as normal, and then I'm going to finish that on my overlocker. Now you don't need to leave a gap or stop to insert the elastic, because we left that hole earlier where we're going to thread the elastic through up here. So you can continue and sew this all together in one step. Now that we've attached our waistband, it's a good idea to go down and iron that flat. So what you want to do when you iron that flat is to actually iron that seam allowance flat, pushing down towards the bottom of the pants. Now, we also want to locate our elastic for this next step, and let's insert that. I'm using a 40mm elastic today. The first step to do is to find a comfortable length around your waist. So I just find this easier than threading the whole lot through. So I'm just going to measure around my waist, cut off that length that's required. Using my elastic threading tweezers, I'm just going to pop them down and anchor them down with the little slider clip. So that gives me a good way. You can also use a safety pin. So now what we're going to do is find that hole in our waistband that we specifically left for this purpose. So locate that hole and start by threading your elastic in. Now, depending, like my elastic's obviously wider than my hole, so I'm just going to fold that so it actually, you can see I'm folding the elastic to pop it through that hole. It just makes it a little bit easier to get through, and then once I'm through, it will naturally go through. So I'm just going to thread the elastic in, making sure not to twist it. Now before I sew my elastic ends together, I'm going to do a final check to make sure that it's comfortable and also my elastic's not twisted. So you may need to use your thumb to just drive that elastic through that hole, which is what I'm doing as I'm pushing it through. I tend to push through about 10 centimeters of fabric and then grab it and then pull it through the elastic. Okay, when I get my end of the elastic through, I like to just pop a safety pin in there and make sure that stretches all the way to the edges so that that elastic doesn't fall through the hole. Okay, now what you should have is your elastic thread nice and evenly through the waistband of your pants. I've still got that pin in there with that little bit that I've folded over sticking out of that hole. So what you want to do now is go and try your pants on for comfort. Make sure they're sitting on your waist where they should be, and check where the elastic is most comfortable. So if you need to tighten it, pull that back out through that hole and reattach that safety pin, and then we'll come back and I'll show you how to finish off the elastic. Okay, once you've tried your pants on and found the comfort level of your elastic and you've got that pinned in place, I want you to pull the elastic out through that hole. You've made sure that your elastic isn't twisted when you've tried them on. So let's just pull it out through that hole as much as you can, because we have to sew the ends of the elastic together. So just keeping it straight, you want to pull it out so you've got enough room to overlap your elastic about 1 inch, and then you've got to be able to sew it. So you might need to push it out a little bit more. So I've got mine marked here. I'm just going to go just a fraction tighter. I'm just going to put a pin in on where I need to have that bottom piece matching up to on my elastic. Rid of my safety pin, move that over. Okay, so now I've got that edge of my elastic underneath and the pin on top where I want that to be joined. I'm just going to pop 2 pins facing this way so that my elastic doesn't move when I attach it together. I find this way I get both edges of the elastic nice and even. So I've now got them attached, and at the back here is that end piece. So what you want to do is go over to your sewing machine and you want to sew a square. So you want to actually sew about 1 inch square. So you'll start about here and you'll sew down here, along, up and along. You can then sew across in the middle of that square, and that will anchor your elastic nice and flatly. Okay, so I've got my 2 pins in. I'm just going to pop my needle down and take out one of those pins. I'm making sure that that elastic is clear of that footbed. I don't want to sew any extra bits of it. I might turn that speed down, and you'll do a back stitch to start. Go right down to the bottom here and just stop. You don't back stitch, so lift up your presser foot, turn your elastic now so that we're sewing this way. Pop your finger where that raw edge of that underpiece is, because you don't want to sew past that. And again, lift your presser foot up. Pivot your elastic. I'm now going down the opposite side of my square and just keeping all other pieces of elastic out of the way as I'm sewing my square. Again, stop before I get to the end, pivot that around. Now you can see that elastic's folding in under there, so you just have to very carefully maneuver it to get out of the way of your square. Now I'm meeting up with the other corner where I started. I'm now going to do a cross. So I'm just feeding my pants all the way through, and I'm going to come on this edge and I'm going to come back down to this corner just to create a nice even, and I'm going to back stitch at that corner. And that will be all I need, and I have created a square and a cross in my elastic. So I've now created that square and the cross diagonal in the elastic. I'm going to cut the ends of my elastic off. Now we're just going to thread that whole elastic all the way back in through that hole. Now there are a couple of methods you can choose to sew that hole closed. You can use a hand stitch to sew it neatly so that you're not going to see it on the outside, or you can sew straight through it on the on your machine, and then that way that will anchor that that will anchor that closed. So what you can do is you can close up those two edges like that and just pop a pin in to close it together, and then you can just go and top stitch that on your sewing machine. But bear in mind that you will see that stitching on the opposite side of your waistband. So I'm just cutting off those excess bits of string. Right. So now we are nearly finished our pants. What we now want to do is go down to the bottom, and we need to hem them. So the hem allowance on these is with a 2 centimeter hem allowance. So there's two options for hemming these pants. You can go and overlock all around the bottom of each leg and then fold them under 2 centimeters and top stitch, which is the method I'm going to do today. The other option is that you fold your pants up 1 centimeter and then do a double fold up another centimeter, so you're hiding that raw edge inside of the pant leg. However, on the outside you will only have a 1 centimeter hem. So either method will work, so choose your preferred method. I prefer, these particular pants, I want a wider hem at the bottom, so I'm going to go and overlock them, and then I'll turn them up and I'm going to hem them on each leg. Now I've overlocked the edge of my pants, and I'm just taking my trusty hemming ruler, and I have used the guide to mark in 2 centimeters. So what I'm doing is folding this on the inside, having that guide at the folded edge, and just making sure that that overlocked edge is 2 centimeters. I'm then popping pins in all the way around, just making sure the hem of my pants is nice and even. So if you go ahead and use whatever marking method, whether you're using a tape measure or you have one of these, and mark your 2 centimeter hem allowance, and then what I'm going to do, I'm going to be sewing mine on the wrong side. So I'm going to start at the inner leg seam, just because I don't want to see the forward and backward stitch on the outside of my pants. I'm going to sew from the inside. I'm going to start at this seam, and I'm just going to sew in the middle of my overlocking to create a nice even hem of my pants. And I'm going to repeat that process on both legs, obviously.